And welcome back to our coverage of ONS 2017. We're here with Phil Robb and Timon Sloan, talking about open source technologies and platforms. And gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thanks for being here. Of course, again, open source technologies and platforms. I also want to talk about the impact of software-defined networking on the communications network, but I'd like to back up just for a moment and talk about the impact of OpenFlow and how that's driven the transformation of software-defined networking. And Timon, I'll start with you.
Okay, yeah, good question. So, SDN and OpenFlow are often linked in people's mind, and that's because OpenFlow was really one of the key enablers that initiated this whole movement that started really notably, 6+ years ago or so. OpenFlow was around breaking apart, a protocol to enable breaking apart the control plane from the forwarding plane, and as such, it's had a tremendous impact. I mean, in a way, it was a key enabler that enabled everything you see here today in the entire SDN movement.
Yeah. Absolutely agree. We found that OpenFlow definitely was a catalyst for a lot of the SDN and network programmability in general. And in particular, in greenfield areas, we see it actually continue to be adopted nicely. I think one of the challenges with OpenFlow in the early days and currently was just keeping the hardware up to date with it. But certainly in the virtual switches, it's done really well and continues to be the leading protocol for actually managing them.
But even, you'd probably agree that even as the leading protocol, it's not synonymous with SDN anymore.
No,
right?
Right? SDN seems to have kind of backed off, and now it's more about network programmability, right? Mm-hmm. It's more about being able to do what you need to do to the network in seconds as opposed to days, the way it used to be. And so when you have a legacy environment, being able to use that programmatic interface for that existing equipment is really important, but again, OpenFlow really led the charge and is certainly used, again, in those greenfield environments.
Right, yeah. So, OpenFlow is really important, I think, but the problems become bigger. The problem spaces become bigger. And so that's what I would...
No, it's a good segue into the next question. So would it be accurate to say that SDN, for lack of a better phrase, I know disaggregate is a word that we could use, but really broken up the network, and now it's up to the guys, or the people in this very room, to really put that back together, Timon?
Yeah, exactly. So, now we've broken the network apart. It started with control plane and data plane being separated. Then two other things happened, I think, as a byproduct of that. One is NFV, and network function virtualization. But really, it was sort of the whole SDN movement that enabled that type of thinking. Again, taking pieces out of the fixed function boxes and running them externally in software. And then the fourth piece is open source, really. Became a critical component of going after the disaggregated network and building components of the disaggregated solution in different ways. And so now we have all these different pieces, the controller, the data plane, open source components, VNFs, but now we have this mess of stuff that you have to put together. So, we've enabled an incredible level of innovation now. You have these pieces you can assemble, but they have to be assembled, and it's not easy to assemble them. And we find that, the users, it's not a simple, trivial problem to put all those pieces back together.
No, not at all. Yeah, and I think open source, what we're really seeing is the softwareization, right, or the constant leverage of software as a way of actually getting new features out as opposed to hardware and embedding it inside of hardware. And if you look at open source, it's really it's both a great way to actually innovate and share that technology to allow for a broad base of use cases to be used, but it's also reuse. Having individual companies build software on their own that is very duplicative to everybody else just slows down the industry. So open source has really enabled new innovation to hit the market much faster. And yeah, a big piece of that, once you actually can disaggregate those components, in particular take the software and make it separate from the hardware, and then use open source components to refactor and actually innovate in those software components, everything's moving faster. If you look at the Etsy architecture for NFV in particular, you've got a variety of open source projects that are now being put back together by vendors and by users to actually make full solutions out of that disaggregated piece parts. But having that disaggregation means they get to pick and choose the functionality in those components that are most suited to their needs. So it's very helpful in the innovation circle.
Timon, in the evolution of SDN, and from your perspective, where do you see or where do you find the most traction?
Well, we're, from the ONF perspective, seeing tremendous traction in the carrier space. I mean, I think people would recognize that it's the hyperscale cloud companies that really have the biggest initial traction. And they have the resources and they have the scale to justify the level of investment to really be able to be the first movers. Those are the Googles, Amazons of the world. The next are really, from our perspective, it's the large telecom providers have, again, the scale and the demand and the need, and are investing and are really transforming their networks and doing a lot there. And I think that in some ways it's the enterprise that has the harder time consuming it because it's complicated right now. You have these disaggregated pieces you need to assemble, and it puts the burden on the network operators or the engineers running the network, and certainly smaller enterprises have a harder time finding those resources. And so it's kind of a trickle-down effect is my perspective and what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I'm seeing enterprise actually kind of ride on the coattails of what the carriers are doing. For us, we've seen, again, lots of carrier pickup, lots of telecommunication pickup in these open source components. Often they've actually started these efforts in open source to get to market faster. Having the combination of real working software in the form of open source tied to standards that are necessary for all of the interoperability, having those two work together actually is getting, again, that innovation cycle moving much faster. So instead of decades, it's taking a small number of years to get an entirely new infrastructure built out. For us, we're actually seeing, in particular, SD-WAN as one of the key technologies that are being picked up by enterprise thus far. In particular, in places like retail, where they want to run, for example, OpenStack and virtual machines for doing business logic, point of sale, inventory, and so forth, but they want to manage it from a central site. And so actually having an SDN network to be able to actually deploy, very similar to VNFs that would run on an edge of a carrier network, we're seeing that model being used inside of retail organizations, for example, as an SD-WAN application using the software-defined networking and NFV type technologies.
That's interesting. You just gave, and I was just going to ask you, could give us an example of the impact or the relationships between open source, SDN, and sort of the traction around SDN. Let me ask you this. If we were sitting here a couple of years from now and I asked the same question, or you answered the same question about the relationship between open source and the traction around SDN, and Phil, I'll start with you. What do you think we would be talking about?
Well, for me, again, SDN is really ending up being a cog in a much larger, complex solution space. And I do think that, be it business logic that's going to be residing on campuses, or again, these wide area network endpoints, such as retail, or if they're going to be used inside of a carrier network, we're seeing, with ONAP in particular, as the most recent full end-to-end service orchestration platform, you're looking at an entire set of open source software, starting at the orchestration layer, having a well-defined environment for VNFs that actually need to deploy into, leveraging SDN controllers, data plane accelerators, virtual switches, the entire lot. What I think we'll be talking about in 2 years is how all of those components are mature in an open source standpoint, so you've got that many more options from an end user, be it in enterprise or be it in the telecommunications market, that's actually leveraging that. Vendors will be putting these solutions together. Some large end users are going to decide to actually go at their own. Others will be evolving over time, but I think what we're going to be talking about is a set of seriously robust open source software that can be leveraged for all of those technologies.
Timon, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, Phil, earlier you touched on that open source is driving new ways of working. That it used to be standards drove innovation, and we had standards bodies that would work on documents and drive alignment and agreement across the industry, and then you'd have vendors implement, and then eventually you'd have deployment, and it was a multi-year process. Could easily be 5-10 years kind of process. And open source is really flipping that on its head. It's having a dramatic impact on the industry. Something we didn't even expect. 4 years ago, we weren't talking about open source at all. 2 years ago, maybe talking about, but still trying to understand and get our hands around. Now we're recognizing that open source is moving faster than standards, and we need to find new ways of working. And that we really see open source working in months. We do these brigades that are weeks or months long, and they're actually producing usable results that are driving the industry forward. And so that we're looking to open source driving standards, flipping the equation on its head. And we at the ONF are starting an initiative around software-defined standards to try to help use the open source, use it, and then derive from it models and APIs around those open source components and try to help the pieces connect. And we're working with the Linux Foundation and the broader ecosystem and really trying to embrace this new way of working. And this is new this year, and so in 2 years from now, I'd really be curious to come back and take a look at what I've just said and see where we are.
Yeah.
I think this is transformative for the industry. I think that there'll be some growing pains here and there, but it's essential to being able to help the industry move forward faster and make us as nimble as we desire to be.
Yeah, I would actually even say we've moved from hardware to software, again, to get innovation cycles moving faster. Similarly, even software used to work in a waterfall model where you do requirements, and that's actually where the standards process took place. You do that in the requirements phase, and ultimately everybody would go implement, and you'd waterfall down to maintenance, right? Software doesn't get developed that way anymore. Now we use an agile method, right? So we're always using incremental, constantly changing and innovating pieces of software. That's why using open source and the reuse aspect of open source gets us to that innovation cycle that much faster. So you end up wanting to iterate through, make sure that you've actually implemented what's necessary from a protocol standpoint or an interoperability standpoint in software, then go back and document that through a set of standards. Right, so another take on the same concept of move quickly with software, but then make sure you get what you've done planted so that those that come behind can actually also implement. And different versions can be implemented.
Yeah, exactly.
So software-defined standards. That's going to be the title of the next segment.
We'll see.
I'm going to hold you both to that.
All right.
That'll be interesting. Phil, it was good to have you. Thanks for being with us. And Timon, thanks for being with us.
Yeah,
nice meeting you, by the way.
Likewise.
Yep.
Yeah,
Until next time, software-defined standards. Remember that. For all of our coverage here at ONS 2017, you can go to tinow.org. So long.